damaging eruption bursts through the ground at Kilauea.
Scary sights this week in the western U.S. as avalanches have kept rescuers on their toes.
A ranch worker in Colorado looked up at the afternoon sky and dropped to her knees. Not because of what she saw in the clouds, because of what was sharing space with the sun itself. Something that should not exist. Something that cast a second shadow across every field, every road, and every face that looked up in that moment. And that was only the beginning. Something that should not exist. A second presence in the sky. Not beside the sun. Not near it. Occupying the exact same space. One burning with familiar light. The other pulling that light inward like a drain. She was not alone. Within minutes, people across 3 counties were stepping out of their trucks, their homes, their fields. All of them looking up. All of them silent. Their phones captured something, but the footage came back distorted. Scrambled. As if whatever was up there did not want to be recorded. By the time the first calls reached local authorities, the temperature had already dropped 15 degrees. In the middle of a 70-degree afternoon, the cattle in open fields moved to the center and stopped. Dogs across the region began howling at the same moment. Not one dog. Not one farm. Every animal within 60 miles responding to something human senses could barely register. That was day 1. What followed over the next 6 days would touch every major city in the United States. It would shut down airspace. It would open the ground. It would force geological experts to admit publicly that their instruments were showing them something their training had never prepared them for. And carved into bedrock beneath one of America's largest cities, rescue teams found a message. A message that was not there the day before. Nobody has explained how it got there. This is where the story starts. The calls started at 2:43 in the afternoon. Not from scientists. Not from government agencies. From ranch workers, farmers, truck drivers pulling over on county roads because something was wrong with the light. Pueblo County, Colorado. A Tuesday afternoon that started like any other. Storm clouds had been building since morning. Nothing unusual for that region. Weather moves fast across the high plains. Everyone out there knows the sky. They read it the way other people read a clock. But this was different. The light breaking through those clouds was not the warm gold of a Colorado afternoon. It was cold. Sharp. The kind of brightness that makes your eyes water before you even look directly at it. Maria, a ranch hand who had worked that land for 11 years, was moving hay bales near the eastern fence line when she noticed the shadows. They were wrong. Every object on the property was casting 2 shadows. One falling the normal direction. One bending the opposite way. As if 2 light sources were operating from opposite positions in the same sky. She looked up. The sun was there. Exactly where it should be. Burning the way it always burned. But something else was there too. Sharing its space. Overlapping it completely. A disk of absolute darkness that made the surrounding sky look bright by comparison. Not a cloud. Not an eclipse. Something with defined edges and deliberate presence that rotated slowly against the solar surface like 2 gears turning against each other. Maria later told her neighbor she felt the air change the moment she saw it. Not cooler exactly. Heavier. Like the atmosphere itself was holding its breath. Within 4 minutes the phenomenon was visible across 3 counties. Cannon City, Florence, Penrose. Hundreds of witnesses stepping outside simultaneously, drawn by the same wrongness in the light without anyone calling them. Cell phones came out immediately. Most of the footage was unusable. Screens flickered. Autofocus locked and released in rapid cycles as if the cameras could not determine what they were supposed to be capturing. The few clips that came back clear enough to examine showed something that image analysts would later spend days trying to explain. The dark disk was not stationary. It pulsed. A slow, rhythmic contraction and expansion at its edges. Not random atmospheric distortion. A repeating pattern with consistent timing that multiple witnesses independently described as similar to a heartbeat. James Chen had tracked weather across Colorado for 18 years. He ran a private meteorological monitoring station outside Florence with instruments precise enough to detect pressure changes smaller than natural variation. At 2:51 that afternoon his equipment started behaving in a way he had never encountered. Barometric pressure was oscillating. Not dropping before a storm. Not rising as systems cleared. Swinging between opposite extremes every 30 seconds, as if the atmosphere above his station could not maintain a stable state. He called his data supervisor, described what he was seeing, was told to check his calibration. His equipment was perfectly calibrated. He checked it anyway, twice. The readings continued. Temperature data was equally impossible. The thermometers registered a drop of 15 degrees across a 12-minute window. Not a gradual cooling, a plunge. Frost appeared on vehicle windshields across the region. Ice crystals formed on dry grass in the middle of a 70-degree afternoon. And then the animals responded. Cattle across every ranch in the affected area moved away from fence lines and gathered in tight clusters at the center of open fields. Not one herd. Every herd simultaneously, as if responding to a single instruction that bypassed every normal trigger for herd behavior. Dogs began howling at 3:04 p.m. across 60 miles of territory, all at once. The sound carried across the plains and created an echo effect that witnesses described as coming from every direction at the same time. Wildlife behaved strangely too. Birds that should have been active in afternoon feeding patterns landed and went still. Deer moved out of tree cover into open ground, which is the opposite of their threat response. Something in the environment had shifted in a way that disrupted every biological instinct across multiple species simultaneously. At 3:07 p.m. the National Weather Service station in Pueblo logged an atmospheric anomaly report. The language in that report was unusually cautious for a government document. It described conditions that fell outside standard meteorological classification. It recommended further monitoring. No follow-up report was ever published. The dual phenomenon in the sky lasted 47 minutes. At 3:30 p.m. the dark disk began to fade. Not dramatically, gradually, pulling back from visibility the way a thought leaves the mind. One moment it was clearly present, then it was almost there, then it was gone. The sun remained normal, unchanged, as if nothing had shared its space for the previous 47 minutes. But the effects on the ground did not reset with the sky. Temperature stayed low. The barometric oscillation continued for another 2 hours. Animals remained unsettled through the night. And across 3 counties, people who had watched the sky together stood in their driveways and fields afterward without speaking. Because they all had the same question. Not what it was. They had seen it. They knew what they had seen. The question was why here? Why now? Why on this specific Tuesday afternoon when 900 miles away in Washington, D.C. something else entirely was happening beneath the ground? Something the people in Colorado knew nothing about yet. The United States Geological Survey operates seismic monitoring stations in every region of the country. Their instruments track ground movement continuously. They can detect a tremor smaller than anything a human being could feel. Their data goes back decades and has been used to map every zone of geological activity across the continent with high precision. Washington, D.C. sits on some of the most geologically stable ground in the eastern United States. No significant fault lines, no mining activity, no underground construction anywhere near the federal district that afternoon. At 2:43 p.m. Eastern Time, the same minute the first calls were coming in from Pueblo County, seismographs positioned around the Capitol building began registering movement. Not a small reading, not instrument noise. A coordinated pattern of subsurface displacement that one monitoring technician described in his shift notes as resembling intentional mechanical activity rather than natural geological movement. His supervisor reviewed the data and flagged it for the agency's anomaly review team. That review has never been made public. 2 events, separated by 900 miles, beginning at the identical moment. One visible in the sky. One registered only by instruments buried in the earth. No weather system connects Colorado to Washington, D.C. No geological formation links the Rocky Mountain Front Range to the mid-Atlantic seaboard. No known natural mechanism produces coordinated atmospheric and seismic anomalies simultaneously across that distance. The Book of Luke describes a time when signs would appear in the sun and in the stars, when nations would be in distress and confusion, when the very foundations of familiar systems would begin to feel unstable. That language was written 2,000 years ago. It described what Tuesday looked like. But Colorado and Washington were not the end of what Tuesday brought. Because while the sky above Pueblo County was returning to normal and seismologists in D.C. were quietly flagging impossible data, a storm system was building over Iowa that would drop something onto American highways that no laboratory in the country could identify. Something that fell from the clouds but did not behave like anything that has ever fallen from clouds before. And embedded inside it, visible only under specialized equipment, were markings. The same markings. In every sample, collected 60 miles apart. The storm over Iowa had been building since noon. Nothing about it looked unusual from the ground. Dark clouds rolling in from the northwest. Wind picking up ahead of the front. Standard late-season weather moving across the cornfields the way it had 1,000 times before. Experienced farmers did not even come inside. But at 4:18 p.m. Central Time, something began falling from those clouds that made everyone stop. The first drivers to encounter it were on Highway 35 near Ames. They heard it before they saw it. A sound against their windshields that was harder than rain, sharper than hail. A rapid tapping that made several motorists think someone was throwing debris from an overpass. They pulled over. What was covering the road and their vehicles was not rain, not sleet, not any form of hail that matched anything in standard meteorological classification. Chunks of ice, perfectly clear, geometrically shaped, some smooth and rounded, others with flat angular faces that caught the strange yellow light filtering through the storm clouds and threw it back in bright flashes. Sarah, a mother driving to her daughter's after-school activity, got out to look at what had landed on her hood. The pieces were not melting. She stood there in above-freezing afternoon air watching ice fragments that showed no sign of the normal melt process. No water forming at the edges. No softening of the surfaces. Just sitting there, dense and cold and completely stable, as if the temperature around them had no authority over them. She picked one up. It was heavier than it should have been. Noticeably heavier. Like holding a piece of metal that had been shaped to look like ice. She put it in a cup holder and drove the rest of the way to the soccer field. When she arrived 40 minutes later, it had not changed size at all. State troopers responding to the highway reports began collecting samples within the hour. Emergency calls were coming in from 6 counties simultaneously. Not just from Highway 35. From rural roads, farm properties, and small towns across a wide band of central Iowa, all reporting the same impossible precipitation falling from the same storm system. The visual appearance was unusual enough. But what made atmospheric physicist Dr. Robert Hayes go quiet when the first samples reached his university lab was not the shape or the density. It was what was inside them. Suspended within the clear ice, visible without any magnification, were dark inclusions. Foreign material locked inside the crystal structure during formation. At first glance they resembled organic debris. The kind of material storm systems occasionally carry aloft from fields and deposit miles from the origin point. But these were not random. Under basic examination, the inclusions showed consistent internal organization, regular spacing, repeating arrangements that did not match any known pattern of debris incorporation during ice crystal formation. Dr. Hayes ran the samples through polarized light microscopy, a standard technique for examining ice crystal structure that reveals internal formation patterns invisible to the naked eye. What appeared under that equipment stopped his graduate team mid-conversation. The inclusions were not debris, they were markings, deliberate in appearance, symmetrical in arrangement, too consistent across multiple samples to be accidental, too regular in their internal positioning to have formed through any known atmospheric process. And they were identical. Samples collected near Ames. Samples collected near Marshalltown. 60 miles of separation. Different points in the storm's movement across the state. Different atmospheric conditions at the moment of formation. Identical internal markings in every single fragment examined. Dr. Hayes contacted colleagues at the National Weather Service. He described what he was seeing without using language that would make him sound unreliable. He stayed technical, stayed precise, described the molecular inconsistencies and the unusual density readings and the anomalous inclusions without speculating about what they meant. The response from the Weather Service was a request for samples to be shipped to a federal analysis facility. Dr. Hayes sent them. He never received a report back. The chemical analysis his own lab ran produced results that deepened the problem rather than resolving it. The ice contained trace elements that do not appear in atmospheric moisture under any natural conditions. Not contaminants. Not industrial residue carried in by wind patterns. Elements that had no business being present in precipitation forming at standard cloud altitudes over central Iowa farmland. The spectrometer returned data his equipment was not designed to process. His graduate student, running the second round of tests, looked at the output and asked if the machine was broken. It was not broken. Across 6 counties the storm continued dropping its impossible cargo throughout the evening. Emergency management offices fielded hundreds of calls from residents who had collected samples and wanted to know if they were dangerous. The state issued a cautious advisory recommending people avoid direct contact until analysis was complete. Analysis was not completing. Every laboratory that received samples reported the same wall. Equipment designed to classify and explain ice crystal formation simply could not produce clean results from these fragments. The data came back incomplete, contradictory, pointing in directions that standard atmospheric science had no framework to follow. And the storm itself was behaving strangely. Meteorological tracking showed the system moving in a pattern that deviated from every predictive model running that afternoon. Wind direction at cloud level did not match surface readings. The storm's forward speed fluctuated in ways that suggested internal dynamics no standard weather model accounted for. Veteran storm spotters who had tracked hundreds of systems across the Great Plains described the cloud formations as unlike anything in their experience. Not visually dramatic, not particularly large, just wrong in a way they struggled to articulate. As if the storm was following instructions that had nothing to do with pressure gradients or temperature differentials. The yellow tint in the light filtering through the clouds was noted by nearly every witness independently. Not a normal overcast gray. A sickly amber quality that made the afternoon feel like a photograph with the color balance shifted slightly off. It lasted 4 hours. When the storm moved east and the precipitation stopped, the fragments already on the ground remained unchanged. Sitting on road surfaces and truck hoods and fence posts. Not melting. Not degrading. Just present. Local authorities had no guidance for disposal. No protocol existed for ice that would not melt at ambient temperatures. Road crews eventually cleared the highway accumulations with standard equipment, but privately collected samples remained stable for days afterward in conditions that should have reduced them to puddles within minutes. The story might have stayed regional. A strange weather event in Iowa. Unexplained precipitation. Laboratory results that confused researchers. Interesting. Unusual. But containable. Except that the same evening the Iowa storm was moving east, something was happening over the nation's capital that federal agencies could not contain or explain away. And the two events shared a detail that no official statement ever addressed. The electromagnetic readings recorded during the Iowa storm matched, almost precisely, the seismic signal patterns registered beneath Washington, D.C. earlier that afternoon. Different instruments, different phenomena, different locations separated by 1,000 miles. The same underlying signature. A researcher at a private atmospheric monitoring firm noticed the correlation at 11 p.m. that night while cross-referencing data feeds. She flagged it internally. Her supervisor told her to document it and wait for guidance. Guidance never came. But the lights above Washington were already visible by then. And what Capitol Police officers were looking at through their binoculars at 9:47 that night was going to make the Iowa ice storm feel like the opening paragraph of a much longer story. A story that was now moving faster. And targeting something very specific. The first hole opened at 11:34 p.m. Pacific time. No explosion. No earthquake warning. No gradual settlement that engineers might have detected with standard monitoring equipment. One moment the ground was solid. The next, a section of Interstate 405 near Los Angeles simply was not there anymore. A perfectly circular void. 60 feet across. Edges so clean they looked machined rather than collapsed. No cracks radiating outward. No debris field. No gradual failure pattern of the kind that precedes every known form of ground subsidence. Just a hole where road had been. The first highway patrol officer on scene walked the perimeter twice before calling it in. His initial report used the word impossible 3 times. His supervisor, listening on the radio, told him to use different language. He did not have different language for what he was looking at. Industrial lighting equipment arrived with the first engineering response team. They rigged lines and lowered the lights into the shaft to assess depth before sending anyone down. The beams did not reach the bottom. Standard industrial lighting capable of illuminating targets at significant depth simply ran out before finding the floor of the shaft, which should not have been possible for a road collapse over natural California geology. Something was down there, but it was not what geology said should be there. While the Los Angeles response teams were still establishing a perimeter, a second hole opened in Chicago. Same diameter, 60 feet exactly, same clean edges, same absence of any warning indicators in the surrounding ground. Same depth that exceeded the capacity of standard lighting equipment. The timing between the two events was not random. Los Angeles at 11:34 p.m. Pacific. Chicago at 1:34 a.m. Central. Adjusted for time zones, both collapses occurred at the identical moment. Atlanta followed. Then Denver. Each hole appearing at the same instant in local time, adjusted across time zones with a precision that no natural geological process could replicate. Dr. Michael Chin arrived at the Los Angeles site at 3 a.m. 30 years of structural geology, earthquake damage assessment, landslide investigation, foundation failure analysis across some of the most geologically complex terrain in North America. He walked the perimeter of the collapse with his instruments running. The surrounding soil showed nothing. No stress fractures, no settlement indicators, no changes in compaction density that would suggest the ground nearby had been affected by whatever removed the material inside that perfect circle. Natural ground collapse leaves evidence in every direction from the failure point. Pressure redistributes. Soil compresses or fractures. Water table changes create detectable shifts in adjacent material. None of that was present. It was as if the earth inside a precise 60-foot circle had been removed without disturbing a single grain of soil outside the boundary. Dr. Chin stood at the edge for a long time without writing anything in his notes. Then he wrote one sentence. This is not a geological event. The pattern connecting the collapse sites was visible by dawn. Every hole had opened within 2 miles of a major financial institution. The Los Angeles void appeared near a Federal Reserve branch. Chicago's collapse materialized adjacent to a major commodities exchange. Atlanta's hole disrupted road access to a Federal Reserve district bank. Denver's opening sat at the edge of a significant banking district. Not near residential areas. Not in industrial zones. Not randomly distributed across metropolitan geography. Specifically positioned relative to the infrastructure of American financial authority. Seismologists monitoring data from stations across the country began noticing something that deepened the alarm considerably. Underground movement was registering on instruments in regions that geological surveys had classified as completely stable. Not small readings. Significant displacement signatures suggesting movement of large volumes of material at depth, but the surface above those readings showed nothing. Dr. Sarah Williams at the U.S. Geological Survey was pulling data streams from Western monitoring stations when the pattern became visible in her analysis. Coordinated movement along subsurface formations that her geological maps said did not exist. Pressure changes at depth that implied structural shifts larger than any known natural process operating in those regions. She ran the data through 2 different analysis programs to check for processing errors. Both programs returned the same results. She called her supervisor at 4 a.m. The conversation lasted 11 minutes. At the end of it, she was instructed to flag the data for federal review and cease independent analysis until she received further guidance. She flagged it. She did not cease analysis. By 5 a.m. she had identified something in the data that she had not been looking for. The underground movement was not random. It was following a path, a deliberate route connecting the collapse sites across the continent through subsurface formations that her instruments were detecting but her maps said should not exist. As if something beneath the country was drawing lines between points. As if the geography of what was happening underground was a message written in the only medium available, the Earth itself. Emergency response teams that rappelled into the Los Angeles shaft at first light found what the lights had failed to reveal from above. The shaft did not end in collapsed geology. It opened into a chamber. The scale stopped the lead engineer mid-sentence when he radioed the surface. The chamber floor covered an area larger than a standard football field. The walls were smooth. Not naturally smooth. Finished. As if shaped by deliberate process over significant time. The ceiling arched above them with geometry that suggested structural intention rather than random geological formation. And on the floor of that chamber, cut into the bedrock in letters 10 feet tall, was a passage. 7 words taken directly from a 3,000-year-old text. The foundations are destroyed. What can the righteous do? That sentence appears in the 11th Psalm, written as a question asked during a time when the systems meant to protect people had stopped functioning, when authority had become corrupt, when the structures of justice had failed and ordinary people had nowhere to turn. It was carved into bedrock beneath Los Angeles with a precision and permanence that suggested someone had put it there to be found. Not recently. The geological formation surrounding the inscription showed age indicators consistent with material that had not been disturbed for a very long time. Certainly longer than any recorded construction in the Los Angeles basin. Possibly longer than any recorded human presence in the region. The same chamber. The same inscription. In identical form. Beneath Chicago. Beneath Atlanta. Beneath Denver. Beneath every city where the ground had opened that night. 15 cities. 15 chambers. One message. The foundations are destroyed. What can the righteous do? Federal response was immediate once the chamber discoveries were reported up the chain. Military personnel replaced civilian rescue teams at multiple sites within hours. Media access to the collapse zones was restricted under emergency infrastructure safety protocols. The geological community went quiet in a way that researchers in the field found unusual. Scientists who had been actively commenting to journalists about the impossible nature of the collapses stopped returning calls. Official statements described the events as infrastructure failures under investigation. No mention of the chambers. No mention of the inscriptions. No mention of the fact that 15 holes of identical dimension had opened simultaneously across the country in a pattern that targeted financial infrastructure with the precision of a deliberate plan. But the people who had been in those chambers had seen what was down there. And they were not staying quiet. Because what was happening on the surface above those chambers, at the exact moment rescue teams were reading ancient inscriptions in the bedrock below, was something that no infrastructure statement or media restriction could contain. The sky above every affected city was doing something that millions of people were watching in real time. And this time there was no equipment malfunction to blame. No atmospheric anomaly to cite. Just lights, positioned with unmistakable intention. Above the exact buildings where the decisions that affect every American life are made. 300 miles east of the Colorado sky anomaly, in the wheat fields of central Kansas, a farmer broke a plow blade on something that should not have been there. Tom had worked that land for 4 generations. His grandfather had broken it from prairie. His father had expanded it through drought years. He knew every rock, every buried fence post, every patch of resistant soil across the entire property. What stopped his equipment that morning was not a rock. The excavation crew he called in brought metal detection equipment as standard procedure before digging. The readings they got back made the lead operator pull his headphones off and look at the device as if it had malfunctioned. Massive iron content, directly below the surface. Not scattered, not random. A structured formation consistent with deliberate human construction. They dug. What emerged over the next several hours forced everyone present to reconsider what they thought they knew about who had been in that part of Kansas before the documented historical record began. Stone walls, 3 feet thick, hand-cut limestone fitted with precision. Mortar that had survived underground for longer than any known settlement in the region had existed. The foundation of a building larger than any frontier homestead. Laid out with the dimensions of a meeting hall or a place of communal gathering. But the floor stopped everyone. Flat stones cut with a precision that the rough wall construction did not prepare them for. Arranged in geometric patterns radiating from a central circle, a design that would have taken months of skilled labor to complete. In a region where no documented community existed at the time the construction methods suggested. At the center of that circle, carved directly into the stone, 7 words. When the sky breaks, remember his promise. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, the archaeologist called to the site, had spent her career excavating frontier settlements across the Great Plains. She knew the material culture of every documented group that had moved through central Kansas from Spanish explorers forward. This structure did not belong to any of them. The construction timeline she estimated placed it before the first documented settlers reached that region by at least 2 decades. Someone had built a permanent structure in the Kansas prairie during a period when the historical record said no one was there. Built it with skill and intention. Laid a floor with geometric precision that spoke of education and purpose. And carved a message at the center that connected directly to sky events. When the sky breaks. The inscription was not dated, but it was clearly not recent. Weathering patterns on the carved surfaces were consistent with the age of the surrounding construction. Someone had written those words and then buried them, knowing they would be found later. Knowing they needed to be found later. The chambers along the inner walls contained additional carved text. Passages from ancient scripture about signs appearing in the heavens. References to the ground becoming unstable during periods of national crisis. Warnings about unusual weather preceding significant change. And buried near the central altar, wrapped in oiled leather that had somehow preserved its contents against the pressure and moisture of more than a century underground, was a journal. Handwritten. Dated entries spanning 3 years in the 1870s. The careful script of someone educated, working on the frontier, recording visions with the systematic detail of a person who needed to be believed by readers they would never meet. The journal belonged to someone identified only as Brother Samuel, a traveling preacher whose name appeared in no historical record that researchers could locate. No church registry, no census entry, no land record, no documented community that acknowledged his presence. But his words were precise. His entries described future events in the kind of specific language that makes historians uncomfortable. Storms unlike standard patterns. Sky phenomena that defied natural classification. Ground instability in places of established authority. Leaders operating from confusion rather than clarity. And throughout the journal, detailed descriptions of signs that would appear in sequence. Signs that would begin in the western sky and move eastward. Signs that would affect the foundations of human authority before any response was possible. His final entry was dated October 1873. He wrote that he was burying the journal at the center of the structure he had built. He wrote that it would remain hidden until the time it was needed. He wrote that its discovery would not be accidental but would coincide with the beginning of the events he had described. The journal was pulled from Kansas soil on the same Tuesday afternoon that the dual phenomenon appeared over Colorado. The same Tuesday that seismic equipment beneath Washington, D.C. registered impossible movement. The same Tuesday that atmospheric data across the Midwest began producing results that federal monitoring stations quietly flagged and did not publish. Researchers who examined the journal's contents noted something that extended beyond its historical curiosity. The sequence of events Brother Samuel described matched the sequence of events unfolding across the country with a specificity that could not be attributed to vague prophetic language interpreted backward. He described the sky event first. Then ground disturbance near centers of authority, then precipitation carrying anomalous material, then lights appearing above places of governmental power, then the ground itself opening to reveal messages. That was the sequence he wrote in the 1870s. That was the sequence playing out across America right now. Biblical scholars brought in to examine the journal's scriptural references identified the passages as consistent with Old Testament prophetic literature. The interpretive framework Brother Samuel used drew from texts describing divine intervention in the affairs of nations that had moved away from foundational principles. Not punishment language, warning language. There is a distinction in that literature between judgments that have already been decided and warnings that carry the possibility of a different outcome. Brother Samuel's journal fell clearly in the warning category. Every entry emphasized that the signs he described were communicative in nature, meant to be understood, meant to prompt response, not the end of something, the beginning of a choice. The Kansas discovery sat in an uncomfortable space between history and what was actively unfolding. Archaeologists wanted to document it carefully. Federal representatives who arrived at the site on the second day wanted access to the journal immediately. The farmer whose plow had started everything stood at the edge of the excavation and watched people in suits photograph pages of handwritten text that described his country's present moment in past tense. He had one question that nobody answered. If Brother Samuel knew this was coming, what did he write about what comes next? The answer to that question was in the final pages of the journal. Pages that federal representatives photographed and did not discuss publicly. Pages that the archaeologist who read them described later as the most unsettling material she had encountered in 30 years of professional work. Not because of what they predicted, because of the date they named. A specific window. Written in plain language. No metaphor. No symbol requiring interpretation. A date range within which Brother Samuel wrote that the sequence of signs would reach its final stage. Researchers who read those pages and were willing to speak about them would only say one thing on record. The date had not passed. It was approaching. And the events already unfolding were, according to the journal's own internal framework, still in the early stages of the sequence, which meant that what America had witnessed so far, the sky event, the seismic anomalies, the impossible ice, the lights over government buildings, the chambers beneath financial centers, was preparation. Prologue. What Brother Samuel described coming after these signs made the events already recorded look minor, and the lights that appeared over Washington, D.C. that same night were beginning to suggest he may have been right. Capitol Police logged their observations carefully. Every unusual sighting, every unauthorized presence, every deviation from the predictable pattern of activity around federal buildings gets documented with timestamps and precise location data. The entry logged at 9:47 p.m. on Tuesday was unlike anything in the archive. A stationary object, approximately 2,000 feet above the National Mall, not moving with wind currents, not displaying navigation lights, not producing any sound detectable from ground level. A sphere of white light roughly the size of a small building hanging motionless over the center of American legislative authority. The officer who first logged it used careful language, described what he observed without interpretation, noted that it did not match the profile of any known aircraft or drone, noted that it was not responding to radio contact attempts, noted that it remained perfectly stationary as wind conditions at that altitude should have produced drift. He called for additional units with optical equipment. By the time those units arrived, there were 4 of them, one above the Capitol, one above the Pentagon, one hovering over the Washington Monument, one positioned above the Lincoln Memorial, not clustered, not random, distributed with precise spacing above 4 locations that represent the 4 distinct pillars of federal authority: legislative, military, national identity, historical unity during crisis. Dr. Jennifer Walsh was still in her Smithsonian office when colleagues began calling her outside. Atmospheric physicist. Years of research into ball lightning, plasma formations, and unusual electromagnetic phenomena. She brought the Institute's telescopic equipment. What she observed through that equipment she later described in a formal report to her department head using language that revealed how far outside her professional framework the experience had pushed her. The objects were not following any known emission pattern. Ball lightning dissipates in seconds. These maintained consistent luminosity for hours. Plasma formations required detectable power input. These showed no measurable energy source feeding their output. Their electromagnetic signature did not match any catalogued phenomenon in the literature she had spent her career studying. But the behavior of electronics in the surrounding area was equally unexplainable. Cell phones pointed toward the lights returned distorted images. Some devices shut down entirely when aimed in that direction and resumed normal function when pointed away. GPS navigation systems throughout the federal district began providing inaccurate location data. Radio communications between federal agencies experienced intermittent gaps that did not correspond to any equipment failure or atmospheric interference pattern. It was as if the objects were not just present in the airspace, they were interacting with the electronic infrastructure below them. At midnight the 4 spheres began to move. Not drifting, not responding to atmospheric conditions, rotating, slowly and with perfect precision around an invisible central point above the Capitol building, maintaining exact spacing throughout the rotation, completing each circuit with identical timing. As they rotated, the color of their light changed, white to gold, gold to amber, amber to deep orange, the transition happening uniformly across all 4 objects simultaneously as if they were operating from a single instruction. Federal airspace monitoring stations tracked the objects throughout the night. Military response protocols for unauthorized objects in restricted airspace were not implemented. No scramble order was issued. No official aircraft approached the phenomena at any point during the hours-long event. The official statement released the following morning described unusual atmospheric conditions under investigation. That statement explained nothing. It addressed none of the specific observations documented by Capitol Police. It made no reference to the electronic interference that federal agency communication systems had experienced. It did not account for the behavior of 4 distinct objects maintaining coordinated movement for hours in the most restricted airspace in the country. But what the official statement could not address was the imagery. Hundreds of witnesses had photographed and filmed the phenomena throughout the night. Most footage showed the same distortion problems that had plagued the Colorado recordings. But several clips captured through specific optical equipment produced clear images. When those images were processed through enhancement software, something inside the spheres became visible. Internal structure, geometric patterns within the light itself, symmetrical designs that pulsed and shifted in repeating sequences, not random, not the chaotic internal movement of plasma or ionized gas, organized, patterned. as if the light was not simply illuminating but communicating in a visual language too complex for immediate interpretation. And the patterns were different for each sphere. The object above the Pentagon displayed angular formations. The sphere over the Capitol showed circular designs. The Washington Monument object carried vertical patterns that echoed the memorial's own architecture. The Lincoln Memorial light revealed arrangements that multiple analysts independently described as resembling dense text, as if each manifestation had calibrated itself to the symbolic function of the location it had chosen. The following evening the same phenomenon appeared over New York. But what happened over Manhattan's financial district was not a repetition of the Washington display. It was an escalation. At 7:23 p.m. Captain Michael Torres was beginning final approach to LaGuardia Airport when he made the transmission that would shut down commercial aviation over the nation's busiest airspace for 6 hours. Multiple objects in the flight path, not appearing on instruments, requesting immediate vector change. 17 words that triggered the largest emergency diversion in New York aviation history. Incoming flights rerouted to Philadelphia and Hartford, departing aircraft grounded. The FAA issuing a temporary flight restriction over Manhattan that officials declined to explain publicly. Captain Torres had logged over 15,000 hours across a 23-year career. What he observed through the cockpit windows that evening had no entry in his training or experience. Vertical columns of light rising from the financial district below. Not searchlights. Not building illumination. Solid pillars extending upward from street level toward flight corridors with a stability that wind at altitude should have disrupted immediately. Each column originated from a specific address: the New York Stock Exchange, the Federal Reserve Building, One World Trade Center, major investment bank headquarters, currency trading centers, not distributed randomly across the city, placed at the precise locations that represent the operational architecture of American financial power. And within a mile of any column, aircraft instruments began failing. Not gradually, immediately. Altimeters providing conflicting readings, navigation systems displaying error messages, radio communications filling with static that followed no pattern consistent with known interference sources. Air traffic controller Janet Rodriguez was managing approach vectors when the reports began arriving simultaneously from multiple aircraft. 7 flights, 3 airlines, all describing identical visual phenomena and identical instrument behavior. Equipment failures do not work that way. Each aircraft carries independent systems that fail through different mechanisms. For 7 planes to experience identical failures simultaneously, they would all need to be encountering the same external condition. They were. The interference reached aircraft before they entered U.S. airspace. International flights from Europe began reporting navigation disruption at distances exceeding 50 miles from the Manhattan columns. Electromagnetic effects penetrating aircraft shielding designed to withstand lightning strikes were reaching instruments at ranges that no ground-based source could achieve through any known mechanism. Ground teams dispatched to the column origin points found nothing. No equipment, no energy source, no physical explanation for what pilots were experiencing from altitude. The disconnect was complete. Aviation personnel clearly observing and instrumentally registering phenomena that left no physical trace at ground level. 6 hours. The columns maintained their positions for 6 hours before fading in the same coordinated sequence they had appeared. Commercial aviation resumed. Instruments returned to normal function. The FAA issued a brief statement referencing atmospheric interference and closed the incident. But the radar data from the 6-hour window contained something the official statement did not address. The electromagnetic interference had not been random. It had followed a schedule, activating at the first column at 7:23 p.m., spreading to subsequent columns at precisely 11-minute intervals, maintaining that timing throughout the event with a regularity that no atmospheric phenomenon could sustain. And the geographic targets formed a pattern that a financial analyst looking at the data later described with one word: systematic. Every node of American financial infrastructure in the country's largest city, addressed in sequence, with the precision of someone who had studied the system and understood exactly which points carried the most load. Whatever was demonstrating its presence over American cities was not doing so randomly. It understood the architecture of American power, and it was working through that architecture methodically. The next phase would make New York look like a demonstration, because what was building across multiple cities simultaneously was not another isolated event. It was a convergence. And the timing of that convergence matched a date that Brother Samuel had written into bedrock in Kansas soil more than a century before. Federal agencies do not go silent without reason. Silence is a decision. It requires coordination. Someone has to decide that no statement is better than any available statement. That decision gets made when every available statement creates more problems than it solves. By Wednesday morning, that calculation had been made across multiple agencies simultaneously. The FAA had no framework for lights that disrupted aviation instruments without leaving a physical trace. The USGS had no classification for ground collapses that left no geological signature in adjacent soil. The National Weather Service had no category for precipitation that maintained structural integrity at temperatures that should reduce it to water within minutes. Every agency that should have been issuing public guidance was instead issuing internal memos about what not to say. State emergency management directors who contacted federal counterparts for guidance on the collapse sites reported the same experience. Initial responsiveness, requests to document and hold, then silence, calls not returned, emails acknowledged but not answered. The information was moving upward through government structures. It was not coming back down. Local officials in the 15 cities with collapse sites were left managing public response without any federal framework to reference. They used infrastructure failure language because it was the only available official category. But the people living near the sites were not satisfied with infrastructure language. They had seen the holes. Some had gotten close enough to look down into them before perimeters were established. They described what they saw to neighbors and posted what they had filmed to social platforms before restriction orders reached local law enforcement. The footage spread faster than the restrictions. Viewers who watched it did not see a normal infrastructure failure. They saw clean edges, perfect circles, depths that swallowed industrial lighting, and in the early footage before federal teams arrived at several sites, glimpses of the chambers below, glimpses of the inscriptions on the chamber floors. The platforms carrying that footage experienced unusual removal activity in the hours following the collapse events. Not comprehensive, not fast enough to prevent the content from spreading, but systematic enough that users noticed the pattern and the noticing itself became additional content spreading across the same platforms. Federal communication disruption was affecting more than public information management. The electromagnetic interference that had shut down aviation over Manhattan was also affecting internal government systems. Not completely, not in ways that prevented function, but in ways that introduced uncertainty into systems that depended on certainty. Military command and communication networks experienced the same intermittent gaps that civilian systems reported. The disruption was not random noise. It followed the same 11-minute interval pattern identified in the FAA radar data. As if whatever was generating the interference had identified the specific frequencies that federal coordination depended on and was demonstrating access to them. Not shutting them down, demonstrating access. There is a significant difference between disruption and demonstration. Disruption is an attack. Demonstration is a message. The distinction matters because it changes what the phenomena were communicating. Not we are destroying your systems. We can access your systems whenever we choose. Senior officials who understood that distinction were significantly more unsettled than those who interpreted it as attack. Because attack has a response protocol. Demonstration of unlimited access has no response protocol. It simply establishes that the demonstrating party is operating from a position of complete capability while choosing restraint. The restraint itself is the most alarming part. Congressional responses ranged from complete silence to carefully worded statements about ongoing investigations. No committee hearings were announced. No emergency sessions called. The standard legislative machinery for responding to national security events remained conspicuously still. Staff members in several congressional offices who spoke to journalists anonymously described an atmosphere of paralysis. Lawmakers receiving briefings who emerged from those briefings asking questions their staffers had no answers to. Senior officials from multiple agencies cycling through the same offices in the same day, which is unusual, and leaving those meetings having produced no visible policy response, which is more unusual. The word being used in those private conversations, according to multiple independent accounts, was the same word: unprecedented. Not dangerous, not threatening, not hostile, unprecedented. As if the people responsible for responding to national crises had assessed what they were dealing with and concluded that their existing frameworks simply did not apply to it. The Book of Luke uses a specific Greek word that most English translations render as perplexity. The original meaning is more precise. It describes a state in which a person or a leadership class faces a problem for which no path forward exists within their available options. Not confusion about what the problem is. Not uncertainty about the facts. Complete absence of any applicable solution. That is a different kind of crisis than the ones emergency management systems are built to handle. Those systems are built for problems that have precedence. For events that fit existing categories. For situations where the question is not what to do but who does it and how quickly. What was unfolding across America did not fit existing categories. The scientists who should have been providing explanatory frameworks were producing data that deepened the mystery rather than resolving it. The security apparatus that should have been identifying threats could not locate sources for the phenomena it was observing. The communication infrastructure that should have been coordinating response was itself experiencing the kind of selective interference that demonstrated external access without providing any target to respond to. And the inscriptions in the chambers. The foundations are destroyed. What can the righteous do? That question from 3,000 years ago was sitting in bedrock beneath 15 American cities being examined by federal personnel who understood its source. Scholars who knew the Psalms could tell them exactly what the rest of that passage said, what it advised. what it offered to people living in a moment when established structures had failed. But the official response apparatus had no mechanism for acting on ancient scriptural counsel, no protocol for a situation in which the most accurate available guidance came from a text written 3 millennia before the problem it was addressing existed. Emergency management directors across the affected cities coordinated through calls that none of them were confident were fully secure. They shared what they knew. They acknowledged what they did not know. They made local decisions in the absence of federal guidance and documented those decisions carefully. And they waited, because everything that had happened so far had a quality that experienced crisis managers recognized. It felt like preparation. Not the events themselves being preparation for something else. The entire sequence, from the Colorado sky anomaly through the Kansas discovery through the Iowa ice through the Washington lights through the Manhattan aviation disruption through the simultaneous ground collapses, felt like preparation. Like conditions being established before something that had not yet arrived. The seismological data that Dr. Sarah Williams had been ordered to stop analyzing independently had continued without her. Automated systems did not receive the same memo. They kept processing. They kept outputting. And they were now showing something beneath Yellowstone National Park that her supervisor had not flagged for federal review, because the readings were new. They had begun exactly 24 hours after the first Colorado sky sighting. Pressure building in a caldera system that underlies 8 states. Not following the gradual pattern of normal geothermal activity. Rising in increments that matched, with uncomfortable precision, the interval timing that had appeared in every other event in the sequence. 11 minutes. The same 11-minute rhythm that had organized the electromagnetic interference over Manhattan was appearing in pressure readings from beneath the largest volcanic system in North America. Dr. Williams saw that correlation at 3 a.m. Thursday. She did not call her supervisor. She documented it, encrypted it, sent it to 3 colleagues at separate institutions with instructions to preserve it regardless of what guidance they received from federal contacts. Then she sat at her desk and looked at the pressure curve her instruments were drawing. And she thought about what Brother Samuel had written in that final journal entry, about what comes after the signs, about the specific window he had named, about the fact that the window had not yet closed. Patterns do not announce themselves, they emerge, quietly, through accumulation. 1 data point means nothing. 2 create coincidence. 3 begin to suggest something. By the time you reach 15 identical chambers beneath 15 American cities appearing on the same night, the word coincidence has lost all functional meaning. What was visible across the events of that week, to anyone willing to lay them side by side and look at the sequence without the interference of official categorization, was a pattern. Not random. Not escalating chaotically. Following a specific internal logic that repeated across every event with the consistency of a structured argument being made in physical reality. The pattern had 4 stages. First, a sign in the sky. Something visible and undeniable that affected the senses directly. That could not be photographed cleanly or explained by existing scientific frameworks. That lasted long enough to be witnessed by large numbers of people across wide geographic areas. And that produced measurable physical effects, temperature changes, animal behavior disruption, atmospheric anomalies, that instruments could record even when they could not explain. Second, a disruption of the systems humans use to maintain order and coordinate authority. Communication interference. Aviation disruption. Seismic activity beneath centers of governmental power. Electronic systems experiencing selective access by an external agent demonstrating capability without deploying it destructively. Third, physical evidence emerging that connected current events to a much older framework. The Kansas journal predating every documented settler in the region. The chamber inscriptions carved into bedrock by no known agency. Precipitation carrying internal markings identical across samples formed under different conditions 60 miles apart. Evidence that whatever was communicating had been planning to communicate for a very long time. Fourth, a direct question, not a statement, not a judgment. A question demanding a response. Appearing in the same words across 15 separate locations simultaneously. Carved into foundation-level bedrock beneath the cities that represent American economic power. The foundations are destroyed. What can the righteous do? That 4-stage pattern appears in the prophetic literature of the Hebrew Bible with notable consistency. The prophets operating during periods of national crisis in ancient Israel followed a specific communicative structure that biblical scholars have categorized and studied extensively. Sign. Disruption. Historical reference. Direct question requiring response. It is not subtle. It was not designed to be subtle. Prophetic literature in that tradition was written specifically to be impossible to misread by a leadership class that had developed sophisticated mechanisms for dismissing unwelcome information. Amos described it as a lion roaring from Zion. You do not misinterpret a lion roaring from a short distance. The only available responses are acknowledgement or deliberate denial. What America had witnessed across 7 days fit that prophetic structure with a precision that scholars who examined the evidence described as either the most significant development in the history of biblical interpretation or the most elaborate coordinated deception in human history. There was no middle option. Either the pattern was real, in which case its implications were enormous, or someone had studied prophetic literature with enough sophistication to reproduce its structure across a continental scale using phenomena that defied the physical laws governing every known human technology. Either answer required taking the pattern seriously. The book of Joel describes a sequence of events preceding a significant historical turning point. Wonders in the heavens and in the earth, blood and fire and columns of smoke, the sun turning dark and the moon to blood before the great and awesome day arrives. For centuries interpreters have debated whether that language was meant as literal description or symbolic communication. What if it was meant as a template, not predicting specific events in specific forms, describing the categories of sign that would appear? Sky phenomena that forced observers to question their assumptions about natural law, ground-level disruption affecting the foundations of human authority, visual phenomena that targeted specific locations with specific meaning, and throughout all of it, a persistent invitation to recognize what was communicating and respond before the communicative phase ended. The invitation has a time limit in that literature. That is the part that does not get emphasized in comfortable settings. The signs are not permanent. The window for response is not indefinite. The prophetic structure that includes signs and warnings also includes a transition point after which the character of what is happening changes from invitation to consequence. Brother Samuel understood that structure. His journal made clear he had studied it carefully. His entries described the signs in sequence, which matched the sequence now unfolding, and then described what followed the signs if the signs produced no response. He did not use the word judgment. He used a word that translates more accurately as weight, as if the accumulated decisions of a nation, left unaddressed, eventually reach a mass that cannot be suspended indefinitely. That comes down not as punishment but as consequence, the natural result of continued motion in a direction that the signs were designed to redirect. The underground chambers contained the question. The foundations are destroyed. What can the righteous do? The rest of Psalm 11 answers that question. It does not answer it with political strategy. It does not answer it with emergency management protocol. It answers it by redirecting attention from the failing foundations to something that does not fail. From the structures humans build and maintain to the authority those structures were always meant to serve rather than replace. The Lord is in his holy temple. The Lord's throne is in heaven. His eyes see. His eyelids test the children of men. That is the answer the psalm provides to its own question. When the foundations fail, the righteous do not put their confidence in the foundations. They remember what the foundations were built on, and they act from that memory rather than from the fear of what the failing structures cannot protect them from anymore. Whether or not a nation that had largely moved away from that framework could access that answer in the middle of an active crisis was the question that religious leaders across the country were wrestling with publicly by Thursday morning. Because the signs had not stopped, Wednesday night brought new developments that moved the pattern from its third stage into its fourth. In addition to the carved inscriptions already present in the underground chambers, rescue teams at multiple sites reported new text appearing on chamber walls. Not carved by tools, not etched by any mechanical process anyone could identify. Letters forming in the stone surface as if the rock were making a decision about what it wanted to say. The language was identified by biblical scholars as consistent with ancient Hebrew script from the period of the major prophets, 8th to 6th century before the Common Era, written by people who had watched a nation ignore warnings until the warnings were no longer the most pressing problem. The translation of the new text was direct. I have shown you signs in the heavens above and wonders in the earth beneath. Will you turn back or will you continue until the warnings become something else entirely? Not judgment. Not destruction. Something else entirely. That phrasing was noted by every scholar who examined the translation. The deliberate imprecision. The refusal to name specifically what the alternative to response would be. As if naming it directly would shift the communication from invitation to announcement, and the communication was not yet ready to make that shift. Still in the invitation phase. Still asking. The timing of the new inscriptions was significant. They appeared at 6:47 a.m. Thursday. Exactly 1 hour before the phenomena that had been operating in sequence began operating simultaneously for the first time. As if the question needed to be posed clearly before the full demonstration began. As if there was a sequence to respect. Sign. Disruption. Historical reference. Direct question. And then, only after the question had been posed, the convergence. All of it at once. Everywhere. At a scale that made every previous event look like a preview. The book of Daniel describes a moment when the writing appeared on the wall of a palace during a feast. Visible, undeniable, in a language the celebrants could see but not read until someone was brought in who understood what it said. What that moment represented in the narrative was not the beginning of the crisis. It was the point at which a crisis already in progress became impossible to continue ignoring. When the people with the most to lose from acknowledging what was happening were forced into direct confrontation with the message they had been avoiding. America was approaching that moment. The question was already on the walls. The convergence that began at 6 a.m. Thursday was the moment the writing became impossible to not read. And unlike the Babylonian palace, this writing was not on one wall in one room. It was beneath every city where the weight of national decision-making concentrated. Beneath every address where the systems that govern 300 million lives are operated. Beneath the foundations. Asking what the righteous would do now that the foundations were visibly failing. And above those same cities, at the same moment, something was happening in the sky that made the Colorado Dual Sun event look like a single candle compared to what was now visible from space. 6 a.m. Eastern Time, Thursday. Every phenomenon that had appeared separately across 7 days began operating simultaneously. Not in sequence, not building gradually. All of it, everywhere, at once. Light columns rose from financial districts in 37 cities. The dual sky phenomenon that had first appeared over 3 Colorado counties was now visible coast to coast. Ground displacement continued in coordinated patterns beneath metropolitan areas from Seattle to Miami. Electromagnetic interference shut down commercial aviation across 14 states simultaneously. And the dark disk sharing space with the morning sun was doing something it had not done over Colorado. It was pulsing in rhythm with a human heartbeat. 72 beats per minute. The average resting rate for an adult human being. Visible across the entire continental United States, a cosmic rhythm that matched the biological pulse of the people watching it. Aviation instrument failures became total across the affected airspace. Not selective disruption affecting specific systems. Complete instrument failure in aircraft throughout 14 states simultaneously. The FAA suspended all commercial flight operations across a region covering roughly 2/3 of the continental US. That had never happened before. Not during the September 2001 groundings. Not during any weather emergency in the history of commercial aviation. Not during any event in the recorded history of American airspace management. Total operational suspension across 2/3 of the country. At the same moment, emergency management systems in affected cities attempted to coordinate response. The communication networks those systems depended on were experiencing the same selective interference that had preceded every other event in the sequence. The 11-minute interval was now compressed. The rhythm had accelerated. As if the pattern was reaching a frequency that human systems could not keep pace with. Dr. Jennifer Walsh was monitoring data from 17 observation stations simultaneously when the convergence began. She had been awake for 31 hours. The readings coming in from her network described energy patterns operating across continental distances with a coordination that, in her formal report filed later that day, she described using a single term, impossible to attribute to any known natural or technological source. That phrase, in the careful language of scientific documentation, meant something specific. It meant she had exhausted every available explanation. It meant the data was showing her something that the framework she had spent her career building could not account for. It meant she was looking at evidence of something operating outside the boundaries of what her discipline recognized as possible. The convergence lasted exactly 1 hour. During that hour, every piece of infrastructure that represented American authority, financial, governmental, military, communicative, experienced simultaneous targeted phenomena that demonstrated access without causing destruction. The lights above government buildings intensified to levels visible in satellite imagery. The underground pressure readings beneath Yellowstone climbed to the upper boundary of what instruments there were calibrated to measure and held there without triggering the surface changes that should accompany that level of subsurface activity. Animals across the affected regions entered the same synchronized behavioral state that had first appeared in Colorado. Not just cattle and dogs. Every species. Urban birds landing on streets and remaining stationary. Zoo animals moving to the centers of their enclosures and facing the same direction. Marine monitoring stations off both coasts reporting unusual cetacean behavior, whales surfacing and remaining at the surface instead of diving, across a geographic range that encompassed the entire continental shelf. Something in the environment was producing a signal that every biological system on the continent was registering. Human nervous systems were not exempt. Emergency rooms in major cities across the affected region reported a significant spike in presentations for symptoms that had no clear medical cause. Disorientation. Sudden onset of profound calm in people who arrived agitated. Reports of hearing sounds at the edge of perception that no equipment could detect. Reports of visual phenomena at the periphery of vision that disappeared when looked at directly. Not mass hysteria. The presentations were too varied, too geographically distributed, too demographically diverse to fit that explanation. Something was affecting human perception across continental distances. At 6:47 a.m., 30 minutes into the convergence hour, the new text that had appeared in the underground chambers began spreading beyond the chamber walls. Witnesses in 3 cities reported seeing the same script appearing on exterior surfaces of the financial buildings that the light columns were rising from. Not painted. Not projected. forming in the material of the buildings themselves. Stone, concrete, glass. The same ancient Hebrew characters. The same question. Will you turn back? Federal response at that point moved beyond standard emergency management into categories that have no public documentation. Military assets were repositioned. Communication protocols shifted to systems with no civilian infrastructure dependence. Senior officials moved to locations that emergency continuity plans designate for situations beyond normal operational parameters. The machinery of response was activating, but it was activating in the wrong direction. Not toward acknowledgement of what the pattern was communicating, toward containment of what the public was seeing, toward management of information rather than response to invitation, which was, according to every prophetic text that the pattern was structured around, precisely the wrong response. The prophetic literature is clear about what institutional self-protection in the face of divine communication produces. Not safety, not containment, acceleration. The signs become louder when the leadership class moves toward management rather than response. The pattern intensifies. The interval between events compresses. The phenomena become less possible to dismiss and more impossible to ignore until the question being asked either receives an answer or the asking phase ends. At 7 a.m. the convergence began to wind down. The same coordinated fade that had ended every previous phenomenon. Gradual. Uniform. All of it dimming together at the same rate across 37 cities and 14 states simultaneously. By 7 a.m. commercial aviation was resuming. Electromagnetic interference was clearing. Light columns were fading. The dual sky phenomenon was returning to normal solar illumination. The underground chambers were quiet. The new text on building exteriors had faded with everything else. And America was standing in a Thursday morning that looked, to anyone who had not been watching, like a normal day. But the Yellowstone pressure readings had not returned to baseline. They were holding, stable at their elevated level, not rising further, not dropping back toward normal, just sitting there at the upper boundary of instrument calibration, waiting. Dr. Williams, who had been monitoring those readings through the entire convergence hour, pulled up Brother Samuel's journal photographs on her second screen. She found the page she was looking for. The final entry. October 1873. The passage that described what came after the signs if the signs produced no response. She read it 3 times. Then she picked up her phone and called the 3 colleagues she had sent the encrypted data to the night before. She told them what the Yellowstone readings were doing. She told them what Brother Samuel had written about this specific moment in the sequence. She told them that according to the journal's own internal timeline, what had just concluded was not the final stage. It was the pause before the final stage, the breath before the last word. And the last word, Brother Samuel had written, would not be a question. Thursday afternoon felt wrong. Not dramatically. Not in a way that would appear in a news report or register on any instrument. Just wrong in the quiet way that experienced people recognize as the space between what has happened and what is about to happen. The kind of stillness that arrives before something that cannot be taken back. Emergency management directors in the 15 collapsed cities had not stood down their response teams. Federal officials who had been cycling through congressional offices since Tuesday had stopped cycling and were simply present. Staying. As if leaving felt like a mistake they did not want to make. The Yellowstone pressure readings held. Unchanged since the convergence ended at 7 a.m. Not rising. Not falling. Holding at a level that Dr. Williams kept looking at because it corresponded to something in the geological literature that she wished she had not found. There is a pressure threshold in caldera system analysis above which the geological models stop being predictive. Not because the models are wrong, because at that threshold the variables become too interconnected to forecast individually. Too many systems affecting too many other systems simultaneously. The models stop predicting. They start describing. The Yellowstone readings had been sitting at that threshold for 9 hours. Whatever was holding them there was not a natural geological process. Natural processes do not hold. They move. They respond to conditions. They progress or regress. They do not sit precisely at a threshold level for 9 hours as if waiting for a decision to be made before committing to a direction. Dr. Williams had sent her analysis to 8 colleagues by mid-afternoon. 6 of them called her back. The other 2 sent written responses that were more careful than phone calls allow. All 8 said the same thing in different words. They had no explanation for what the instruments were showing. In the underground chambers, federal personnel were still present, documenting, photographing, consulting with scholars who had been brought in under clearance agreements that included language about public disclosure that the scholars were not comfortable with but had signed. The inscriptions on the chamber floors had not changed. The question was still there, carved in the bedrock with the permanence of something that was not interested in being removed or ignored. The foundations are destroyed. What can the righteous do? One of the scholars, a specialist in Second Temple period Hebrew literature who had spent 30 years studying the intersection of prophetic text and historical event, sat on the chamber floor of the Los Angeles site for 2 hours without producing any notes. His graduate student who accompanied him said afterward that he sat there reading the inscription over and over with an expression she had never seen on his face in 3 years of working with him. Not confusion, recognition. As if he was seeing something he had been reading about his entire career suddenly existing in 3 dimensions in front of him. He said one thing before they were escorted back to the surface. He said the question carved in the floor was not the end of the psalm. He said everyone was reading the inscription and stopping at the question because the question was the most visible part, the largest letters, the most prominent positioning. But the psalm does not end with the question. The psalm ends with an answer. And if whoever had placed the inscription intended the full psalm, then the answer was also somewhere in those chambers. They had not found it yet. Federal teams began a second systematic search of all 15 chamber sites at 4 p.m. Thursday. They were looking for the second half of a 3,000-year-old text that, if the pattern held, would tell them not just what was happening but what was coming. In the pattern that had structured every event of the past week, nothing had appeared without its completion. The dual sky phenomenon had appeared and faded with precise timing. The ice had fallen and the storm had moved east. The lights over Washington had brightened and dimmed on a schedule. The convergence had risen to its peak and wound down in the same coordinated rhythm. Every event had a shape, a beginning, a middle, and an ending, except one, the Yellowstone pressure. It had risen. It had held. It had not completed its shape. Whatever it was building toward had not yet arrived. Brother Samuel's final journal entry described what the last stage of the sequence would look like. Not in symbolic language. Not in the metaphorical register that prophetic writing sometimes uses when the literal description would be too destabilizing to communicate directly. In plain language, the scholars who had read those pages and agreed to speak on record would only say that what he described was unprecedented in scope, that it would be unmistakable, that it would not permit the kind of official categorization that had absorbed every previous event in the sequence without producing a national response, that it would require a response. One of them, when pressed, said that Brother Samuel had written about it not as an ending but as a door that could go in either direction. One direction led somewhere the journal described with language borrowed from the oldest and most hopeful texts in the Hebrew Bible. Restoration language. Return language. The kind of words used when something that had been lost for a long time is found again. The other direction led somewhere Brother Samuel declined to describe in detail. He wrote only that the earth would remember. At 6:23 p.m. Thursday, 17 minutes before sunset on the eastern seaboard, Dr. Williams' instruments registered the first change in the Yellowstone pressure readings since the convergence ended. Not dropping, rising, slowly, incrementally, but with the kind of consistency that geological models describe as committed movement. Not a fluctuation, a direction. She called her supervisor. This time he answered. She described what she was seeing. He was quiet for a long time. Then he asked her one question. He asked her how long. She looked at the rate of increase, ran the projection against the threshold models, checked the calculation twice. She told him the number. He was quiet again. Then he told her to keep monitoring and to document everything and to not make any other calls. She agreed. She documented. She did not make other calls, but she looked at the rate of increase one more time. And she looked at the date in Brother Samuel's journal on her second screen, the specific window he had named, the window that had not yet closed. And she understood, with the particular clarity that comes from having spent a career studying systems at the moment before they change state, that the 9 hours of stillness were not a pause in the sequence. They were the sequence completing its preparation. Everything that had happened across 7 days. Every sign. Every disruption. Every inscription. Every question carved in bedrock and written in ancient script on chamber walls across 15 American cities. All of it had been moving toward this. Toward a pressure curve rising in a caldera system beneath 8 states. Toward a rate of increase that, if it held, would reach critical threshold in a window that matched what a Kansas preacher had written into stone in 1873. Toward a moment that was no longer approaching. It was here. And the question carved into the bedrock of the nation, the question that had been sitting in the foundation since before anyone alive was born, was still waiting for its answer. The Lord is in his holy temple. The Lord's throne is in heaven. His eyes see. Outside Dr. Williams' window, the last light of Thursday was fading from a sky that looked, to anyone not watching the instruments, completely normal. But the instruments were not lying. And the pressure was not stopping. The readings Dr. Williams sent to her 8 colleagues that evening contained one additional data point she had not included in her earlier transmissions. A secondary signal embedded in the Yellowstone data. A pattern within the pattern. Something that should not appear in geothermal instrumentation under any conditions. It was the 11-minute interval. Still running. Still counting.